Welcome back to the Political Brief, where we break down the biggest political confrontations, Senate hearings, and moments that expose what's really happening behind the headlines. Today, we're looking at a hearing that brings back one of the most explosive moments in Supreme Court confirmation history. A nominee standing before the Senate and accusing the process itself of becoming a political circus. But there's a bigger issue underneath the confrontation. What happens when political power, personal allegations, media leaks, and the reputation of a Supreme Court nominee all collide? And as you'll hear, the nominee isn't just defending himself. He's questioning whether the entire process has crossed a line. Let's get into it.
Senator Cornyn.
I'd like to go to the video, please.
Committee will please come to order. Judge, it's a tough day and tough night for you, I know. Let me ask, do you have anything you'd like to say before we begin? I understand that your preference is, which is totally and completely understandable, that we go 1 hour tonight, 30 minutes on each side. Am I correct in that?
That's right.
Do you have anything you'd like to say?
Senator, I would like to start by saying unequivocally, uncategorically, that I deny each and every single allegation against me today that suggested in any way that I had conversations of a sexual nature or about pornographic material with Anita Hill, that I ever attempted to date her, that I ever had any personal sexual interest in her, or that I in any way ever harassed her. A second, and I think more important point, I think that this today is a travesty. I think that it is disgusting. I think that this hearing should never occur in America. This is a case in which this sleaze, this dirt, was searched for by staffers of members of this committee, was then leaked to the media, and this committee and this body validated it and displayed it at prime time over our entire nation. How would any member on this committee, any person in this room, or any person in this country would like sleaze said about him or her in this fashion, or this dirt dredged up, and this gossip and these lies displayed in this manner? How would any person like it? The Supreme Court is not worth it. No job is worth it. I'm not here for that. I'm here for my name, my family, my life, and my integrity. I think something is dreadfully wrong with this country when any person in this free country would be subjected to this. This is not a closed room. There was an FBI investigation. This is not an opportunity to talk about difficult matters privately or in a closed environment. This is a circus. It's a national disgrace. And from my standpoint, as a black American, as far as I'm concerned, it is a high-tech lynching.
Senator
That was 32 years ago. And I'm reminded as I get older that not everybody's had the same experience or memories that I have. That was one of the searing memories that I've had about Supreme Court confirmation hearings, and I think provides an important context for today's hearing. The truth is that, as Senator Kennedy said, starting perhaps with the Bork nomination, that members of the United States Supreme Court, when they've been nominated for the job, have been subjected to relentless campaigns of harassment, and intimidation, which, as Justice Alito recently pointed out, can lead not just to intemperate attacks like the Senate Majority Leader made against Senator Gorsuch and Judge Gorsuch and Judge Kavanaugh by name back in 2020. It could lead unstable individuals to decide that they are going to conduct an assassination of these members of the Supreme Court. So things have gotten terribly out of hand. Judge Mukasey, you and Mr. Dupree both talked about the separation of powers. I looked back at the rules of the United States Senate, our ethics rules by which we are governed, and they are rules that are set by the Senate itself. How do you think the Senate would react if the United States Supreme Court said, we don't like the ethics code of senators or members of the House of Representatives? Would the same principle of separation of powers and co-equal branches of government apply in that circumstance?
Yes, of course it would, Senator. This body sets the rules for its conduct, and the same way that the court sets the rules for its conduct, and the executive, in the person of the president and the vice president, set the rules for theirs. That's not to say that laws of general application don't apply. Of course they apply. But when you're talking about the particular rules relating to a particular branch of government, those are set by that branch of government.
Mr. Dupree?
I agree with Judge Mukasey, and I would add, Senator, in response to your question about the importance of the separation of powers, I think it's important to underscore that the separation of powers is not some sort of academic concept that was invented by law professors. This is a concept that is structurally baked into our Constitution, and the framers viewed as absolutely crucial to preserving not just the independence of each branch and ensuring that the judiciary could act independently, but also to preserve freedom and individual liberty. And so the things we're discussing today obviously have practical consequence in terms of granular information about data and disclosure and the like, but at the end of the day, what's really on the table is a concept that is absolutely fundamental to our constitutional structure and must be preserved.
I think Justice Scalia pointed out, among others,
Senator's
that
time has expired minutes ago. Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to each of you.
Okay, let's stop right there for a second. Because if you're watching this exchange from a conservative perspective, there's one thing that immediately jumps out. This isn't just about one nominee. This is about what happens when the confirmation process for the highest court in America becomes a political battlefield. And frankly, we've seen this movie before. The nominee begins by doing something that should be obvious but was absolutely necessary in this hearing. He unequivocally denies the allegations being raised against him. He says he never had conversations of a sexual nature or about pornography with Anita Hill, never attempted to date her, never had a personal sexual interest in her, and never harassed her. Those are serious allegations. And to be clear, those allegations and his denials are matters that have been debated for decades. We shouldn't pretend that a political commentator sitting behind a microphone today can magically determine every disputed fact from a few minutes of testimony. But here's what I absolutely believe. Serious accusations deserve serious scrutiny, and the person accused deserves due process. That's not a controversial conservative principle. That's an American principle. You don't destroy someone's reputation first and then ask questions later. You don't leak damaging information to the media and then act shocked when that information becomes national news. And you certainly shouldn't treat an allegation as a conviction. That's where this hearing gets extremely uncomfortable. The nominee essentially says, how would any person in this room feel if the same thing were done to them? Think about that. Imagine you're a private citizen. Imagine somebody digs through your past. They find allegations, rumors, embarrassing conversations, old disputes, or accusations that you've denied. Then that material gets leaked. The media gets hold of it. And suddenly your personal life is being broadcast across the entire country. Would you want the public to automatically assume you were guilty? Of course not. And that's why the presumption of innocence matters. It matters when the accused person is popular. It matters when the accused person is unpopular. It matters when the accused person is conservative. It matters when the accused person is liberal. And it matters when the accused person is somebody you absolutely cannot stand. Because if your commitment to due process disappears whenever you dislike the person being accused, then you aren't defending a principle. You're defending a political team. And that's one of the biggest problems with American politics today. Too many people don't actually have principles anymore. They have teams. If their side is accused, suddenly we need evidence. If the other side is accused, suddenly the accusation itself is enough. That's not justice. That's tribalism. And I think conservatives should be particularly careful about falling into that trap. Now, the nominee goes even further. He calls the hearing a travesty, a disgrace, and a circus. That's incredibly strong language. But ask yourself why somebody in his position would speak that way. This isn't a guy sitting on a podcast with nothing to lose. This is a Supreme Court nominee sitting before the United States Senate, knowing that every word he says is going to be scrutinized. He is essentially arguing that the confirmation process itself has become abusive. And that's where I think we need to separate two different questions. First, were the allegations worthy of investigation? That's one question. Second, was the political and media process surrounding those allegations fair? That's another question. You can believe allegations deserve to be investigated while simultaneously believing that leaks, public humiliation, political theatrics, and character assassination are unacceptable. Those positions aren't contradictory. In fact, they're necessary for a functioning constitutional republic. Because if we establish the precedent that anyone nominated for the Supreme Court can have their entire private life dragged into national television without meaningful standards of evidence, what happens next? Every nominee becomes vulnerable to political destruction. And once politicians learn that, the temptation becomes obvious. Don't beat your opponent on constitutional arguments. Don't debate their judicial philosophy. Don't convince the public that your nominee is better. Instead, dig through their past and find something explosive. That's a dangerous road. And conservatives should understand this, because conservative nominees have repeatedly faced intense political opposition during confirmation battles. We've seen it with Robert Bork. We've seen it with Clarence Thomas. We've seen it with Brett Kavanaugh. And we've seen it in countless other judicial confirmations where the confirmation process became less about constitutional philosophy and more about political warfare. Now, I want to be fair here. Democrats and liberals would obviously tell you that their concerns about nominees aren't automatically political harassment. And they're right about that. The Senate has a legitimate responsibility to investigate nominees. If credible information comes forward about a potential Supreme Court justice, senators should absolutely examine it. The Senate shouldn't rubber stamp anybody simply because the president nominated them. That's part of the constitutional process. But there is a line, and that line is fairness. There has to be a difference between legitimate investigation and political destruction. There has to be a difference between asking difficult questions and trying to publicly humiliate somebody. And there has to be a difference between evidence and gossip. Those distinctions matter, because the Supreme Court isn't supposed to be an extension of Congress. It's supposed to be an independent branch of government. And that brings us to the second major issue in this hearing: separation of powers. This part of the testimony is incredibly important. The senator asks about ethics rules and essentially raises a constitutional question. If Congress creates its own rules of conduct, what happens if the Supreme Court decides it doesn't like those rules? Would the court have the authority to impose its own ethical standards on Congress? And the answer from the witnesses is essentially that each branch has its own authority and responsibilities. That's not some obscure technicality. That's the foundation of the American system. The founders didn't create a government where one institution gets to control everything. They divided power. Congress has legislative authority. The president has executive authority. The courts have judicial authority. And those branches are supposed to check each other. Why? Because the founders understood something that modern politicians sometimes forget. Power is dangerous when it becomes concentrated. That's one of the most important lessons in American history. You don't need a dictator for freedom to disappear. You can lose liberty through institutions gradually accumulating authority until nobody is capable of stopping them. That's why the Constitution deliberately creates competing centers of power. And that's why the separation of powers matters. The witness makes an excellent point when he explains that separation of powers isn't merely an academic concept invented by professors. It's built into the structure of the Constitution. And that matters because we're talking about the independence of the judiciary. Think about what happens if Congress can effectively dictate the internal rules of the Supreme Court. Now imagine the opposite. Imagine the Supreme Court could dictate the internal rules of Congress. Would Americans accept that? Probably not. And that's precisely the point. The branches are supposed to have independence. That doesn't mean they're above the law. It doesn't mean Supreme Court justices should have no ethical standards. And it doesn't mean Congress shouldn't be held accountable. What it means is that constitutional authority has boundaries. There are laws of general application that can apply to everyone. But the internal operations of each branch involve questions of institutional authority. That's where separation of powers becomes important. And here's my concern as a conservative. We've created a political culture where politicians increasingly seem to believe that every problem can be solved by giving government another layer of authority. Something goes wrong, create a new rule. Someone behaves badly, create a new regulation. An institution makes a controversial decision, give another institution more power over it. Eventually, you end up with a government where everybody has authority over everybody else. That's not freedom. That's bureaucratic warfare. The founders understood that government needs boundaries, and conservatives should never stop emphasizing that. Now, let's go back to the nominee's claim that this hearing is a high-tech lynching. That's an explosive phrase, and it's obviously going to generate controversy. But regardless of whether you agree with that specific characterization, the broader argument he's making is worth examining. He's saying that a person's identity, reputation, career, and family can be destroyed through a combination of political pressure and national media attention. And unfortunately, in today's political environment, that concern hasn't disappeared. If anything, technology has made it more powerful. Back then, information could be leaked to newspapers and television networks. Today, a single allegation can explode across social media within minutes. A clip can be ripped out of context. A headline can go viral. Millions of people can form an opinion before they've even heard the full testimony. And once the internet decides somebody is guilty, good luck changing that perception. That's why we have to be extremely careful. The court of public opinion is not the same thing as a court of law. And social media is definitely not a courtroom. This is where I think conservative media and conservative audiences need to maintain discipline. We should demand accountability. Absolutely. We should expose corruption. Absolutely. We should investigate powerful people. Absolutely. But we shouldn't become the very thing we're criticizing. If we're angry when the left treats accusations as convictions, then we can't do the exact same thing when the accusation is against somebody we dislike. If we're demanding evidence from Democrats, we have to demand evidence from Republicans too. That's what makes the argument stronger. That's what separates constitutional conservatism from simple partisan rage. Now, the testimony also brings up something else that deserves attention: the potential consequences of political rhetoric. The witness mentions how confirmation battles can involve harassment and intimidation, and even raises concerns about unstable individuals potentially becoming violent toward Supreme Court members. That's not a minor issue. Political rhetoric has consequences, and I'm not saying politicians shouldn't criticize judges. They absolutely should. If a Supreme Court justice makes a terrible ruling, politicians should say so. If a nominee has a judicial philosophy that threatens constitutional rights, senators should expose it. If a justice makes a decision that conservatives believe is wrong, conservatives have every right to fight back politically. But there's a difference between political opposition and personal demonization. That distinction has been disappearing, and we got to bring it back. You can say, "I strongly disagree with this justice." You can say, I believe this nominee's judicial philosophy is dangerous. You can say, I will vote against this nominee. All of that is legitimate. But when political rhetoric turns into, this person is evil, this person is an enemy of America, this person must be destroyed, that's when things can become dangerous. And this applies to both parties. We shouldn't want political violence. We shouldn't want threats against judges. We shouldn't want threats against senators. We shouldn't want threats against nominees. And we shouldn't want anyone thinking that political disagreement justifies violence. Because the moment that happens, the constitutional system begins breaking down. We settle disagreements through elections, legislation, courts, debate, and peaceful political action, not intimidation. That's the American way. And I think that brings us to the bigger lesson from this hearing. Supreme Court confirmations are always going to be political. Let's stop pretending otherwise. The Supreme Court has enormous power. Its decisions can affect abortion, religious liberty, gun rights, free speech, federal power, elections, property rights, executive authority, and countless other issues. Of course, politicians care about who sits on that court. Of course, voters care. Of course, interest groups care. That's democracy. But political doesn't have to mean corrupt. It doesn't have to mean dishonest. And it doesn't have to mean destroy the person standing across from you. We can have fierce disagreement while still maintaining basic standards of fairness. And that's what I would want from any Senate confirmation hearing. Ask tough questions. Demand answers. Investigate serious allegations. Examine someone's record. Challenge their constitutional philosophy. But once you start using someone's private life as ammunition simply because you want to defeat their nomination, we've crossed into dangerous territory. And if we normalize that, don't be surprised when the next political party does it to your nominee. Because political weapons don't stay on one side forever. They get copied. And that's why conservatives should be thinking beyond the immediate political victory. Maybe today you enjoy watching the other side get destroyed. But tomorrow, the exact same weapon could be turned against someone you support. And then you'll suddenly be asking, where is the fairness? Well, fairness should have mattered from the beginning. That's why due process matters. That's why evidence matters. That's why constitutional limits matter. And that's why the separation of powers matters. At the end of the day, I'm not interested in telling you that every allegation against a politician or nominee is automatically false. That's irresponsible. And I'm not interested in telling you that every allegation is automatically true either. That's equally irresponsible. I'm interested in something much simpler. Show us the evidence. Let the accused respond. Let the Senate investigate. Let the public hear the arguments. And then let people make an informed judgment. That's how a constitutional republic is supposed to work. Not through anonymous leaks. Not through media hysteria. Not through political intimidation. And certainly not through a confirmation process where the goal becomes destroying someone's reputation rather than determining whether they're qualified to serve. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. If America loses the principle of fairness, nobody wins. Not conservatives, not liberals, not Republicans, not Democrats, and certainly not ordinary Americans. The Constitution is bigger than any individual politician. It's bigger than any Supreme Court nominee. It's bigger than any political party. And it has to be, because politicians come and go, presidents come and go, senators come and go, judges come and go. But the constitutional framework is supposed to endure. That's why the separation of powers is so important. That's why due process is so important. And that's why confirmation hearings should be about more than political revenge. So watching this exchange, my takeaway as a right-leaning American is pretty straightforward. Investigate, question, challenge, demand accountability. But don't turn accusations into convictions. Don't weaponize personal destruction. Don't allow political parties to become more powerful than constitutional principles. And don't forget that the same government power you celebrate when your side controls, it can become the weapon you fear when the other side takes control. That's the lesson conservatives should never forget. Limited government isn't just about limiting the other party. It's about limiting government itself. And if we're serious about protecting American liberty, that's the principle we need to defend. And that's my take on this hearing. A Supreme Court confirmation should absolutely involve tough questions and serious scrutiny. But there's a huge difference between accountability and political destruction, and this exchange forces us to ask where that line should be. Do you think the confirmation process has become too politicized? And when serious allegations emerge against a Supreme Court nominee, where should the line be between legitimate investigation and public character assassination? Let me know what you think in the comments. If you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe to the Political Brief for more political hearings, confrontations, constitutional debates, and commentary from a perspective focused on American liberty, limited government, and accountability. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.